All right, here we are for another biology video. This one is about speciation still, right? This week we're talking about how are new species created. Um, and this video in particular is going to talk about some of the different variations on how that would work. So let's make sure that we start with just the idea of speciation, right? Again, there's two main ways for speciation to happen, where one species gradually turns into another one, or when one group splits into two groups or more groups, and then each group um, evolves separately because they've been separated somehow or another, right? And there's all these reproductive isolation scenarios that we talked about in the last video. Now, an example of this was the California salamander activity that you just did, right? And so you're presented with this map, and all the squares show where salamanders were found by these scientists from UC Berkeley. And the first thing that you were going to notice is that the salamanders are pretty much found all over the place, except for right here, where the black ones are, and then right here, right? And those are the places, the Central Valley, which is this one, and then the desert, which are too dry for the salamanders to survive there, right? And so then you were asked to put the pictures of the salamanders next to where they were found, and you saw this pattern where the spotted ones were found in the mountains inland, and the more solid colors were found on the coast, right? And so this this observation led the scientists to think that this was an example of speciation, because the original group came down from Oregon heading this way, and then they hit a barrier, right? The barrier of the Central Valley, which you couldn't get past. So they had to split. And one group went along the coast, and another group went into the mountains inland. And then they travel down the coast until they get close to Southern California, right? And of course, salamanders move real slow, so this took a very long time. And on their way, they slowly changed, right? You can see the changes that they would change here, and then when they got down here, they were a little different color, and then by the time they got down here, they were a different color, right? And so you have your isolation, where the two groups split, and then natural selection is working on them the whole time that they are slowly migrating their way south uh, until you get down here, right? And here's where you found two species, C and B, that were right on top of each other. The mountain and the coast salamanders were very close to each other. And so they wanted to know if those were mating. And so then you get more information where they went out to find more traps. And they found that there were actually matings between some of these small groups. This one would have been between the purple and green, I believe it would have been. And then like this one right here would have been between the green and the brown, I'm pretty sure. This one was between the green and the brown, where the pink ones are. But they did not find any hybrids down here, right? And so along the way, the groups that look different, like these groups, I guess it would have been this one and this one, these groups look different, but they were still close enough that they could have reproduced to make these hybrids. But these two groups are not close enough, or it doesn't seem that way, because there was never found any hybrids down here between those species, right? And so this is in fact an example of speciation, where reproductive isolation led to differences that eventually made them too different to mate, right? And so here we have, this again, this is the more common method for speciation to happen, right? And so that's the basic story of all of the evolution on Earth, that you have natural selection and speciation happening all the time in various different ways. And so we can kind of make some generalizations about these things. And the biggest and most important generalization is that the rate and direction of evolution is affected by the environment. How many species you get and how fast it happens depends on the biotic and abiotic factors, right? The food that's around there, what's happening with the physical environment, rivers showing up, rivers drying up, all kinds of different versions of environmental change, right? If the environment is stable, or at least for a while is stable, then this would usually lead to gradual evolution. It would be slow. Think of like the horses, where the horse ancestors were small deer-like species, and then over time, their foresty environment slowly turned into a plains environment. And so the horses, along with the environment, slowly changed to just get bigger and bigger and bigger, of course, and then their feet changed to get hooves, right? But a stable or a slowly changing environment is going to lead to a much slower evolution than a fast changing environment, right? Because if the environment is changing, then this is going to lead to pressure, selection pressure, right? The more the environment changes, the more difficult it is for organisms that used to be just fine in that environment to live in that environment anymore, right? And so maybe if it's changing a lot, things that traits that would have been good at one point now aren't good because the environment changed, and traits that weren't very useful before now are. And depending on how stable the environment is, this could be happening literally from one generation to the next, which would lead to a lot of different opportunities for speciation and natural selection to happen, right? Of course, if things change too quickly, then this leads to extinction, right? Unless the variation, the good variation that was going to help everybody, was already present in the population, then you have to just wait until a mutation shows up. And if the environment's changing so fast that the mutation can't show up, then nobody gets the mutation, and it leads to the extinction of the species, right? And so, of course, the environment on Earth has had periods of stability and periods of chaos, which we will talk a little bit more about as we go along. Now, one really interesting example of how this would work is something called adaptive radiation. As you can see the definition, when many species evolve from one common ancestor. And this is everyone's favorite story about Darwin's finches. This diagram, again, is kind of like it's an evolutionary tree, it's like a pedigree, but for species, not for families. And we're going to look more at these as we go along next week. But the important thing here is that one ancestor led to all these different species, right? All of these are very closely related species, and they came from this original one that came from the South American mainland, from Ecuador, over here, right? Now, the Galapagos is pretty far away, not ridiculously far away, but far enough away that animals aren't going to just fly there just to fly there and come back in the same day, right? This is going to be a long trip. And so any organisms that would make it here, they either are long distance kind of migratory animals, or they happened to just happen upon here during, say, a storm or something. And so that's what we think happened with the first finches from Ecuador, the ones that looked more or less like this. They were over here, and then they get blown over by some sort of storm. And they find themselves on these islands that are, these are volcanic islands, which means that it's very rocky, not a lot of plant life. There aren't that many other species out there. And importantly, there weren't very many bird species. There were some iguanas and some tortoises and some penguins, but penguins aren't the same kind of birds that we're talking about here, right? And so these birds did what all of the birds would have done, is that once they finally made it here, they got blown by some storm or something, they then spread out to all the other islands, right? Now, the thing about it is that the islands are all slightly different. Some of them have more vegetation than others. Some of them have more shady places. Some of them are just really open, just like really barren, kind of deserty even landscapes. So each island has its own landscape. And so as the birds lived inside of the place where they found themselves, they started to change. Maybe this place over here had seeds that were a lot bigger, and so the birds needed a bigger beak. And the birds with the biggest beaks, they survived. The smallest beaks died, and over time, the birds on that island have a big beak. But maybe over on this island, there was a lot of small seeds, and so having a smaller beak was more important. And then there was the opposite, right? And then some of them, maybe there's places where there's more insects than others, and so the beaks adapted for insects. And so one group then had a bunch of different adaptive radiations, and reproductive isolation, rather. That's what I was trying to say. Lots of different isolation. And then as each group stayed where they were staying, then they led to these different beaks. And then the beaks led to eventually the separation of the species. Now, the thing about these islands is that there's actually a lot of different ways that the birds changed. It wasn't just from island to island; it was on an island itself. It turns out, if you look at these some of the descriptions here, that you have your seed eaters and then your cactus eaters. But these are all part of the ground finch group, right? So the ground is a different environment than up in the tree, right? And so you don't have to just separate yourself in terms of like literally different islands, but just your vertical location within the island on the ground versus the trees. And so this is an idea of something called a niche. Very important word, right? A niche is your way of life, your role in the ecosystem. It is a lot about location, but it's also about what kind of food you eat, what kind of shelter you need, how do you go about surviving, right? And so you can see on this table here, we have the niches. And they're just general strategies, burrower or climber, right? How do you catch your food? Well, one way you can catch your food is by being really sneaky and stalking them, like a cat does, right? And so in these placental mammals, this table or this part of the table right here, these are the normal mammals that we know of. And this is an example. An ocelot is just a cat. There's lots of different cats out there that are stalking predators. Now on Australia, they don't have very many normal mammals. They have these marsupials, right? Marsupials are distant relatives of mammals that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But the ability to stalk and sneak up on your prey is a good one. And so any animal that has a variation that allows it to start making this behavior is going to have an advantage. And so over time, something resembling a cat evolves in a totally different location than where regular cats evolved, right? And the same thing goes for all of these. You have your chasing predator, the wolves that we have here in North America and in Europe and things like that. And there's also a Tasmanian wolf that isn't even related to regular wolves at all, but the job of chasing predator was open in Australia. And so an animal evolved to fill that spot, to fill that niche, right? And we'll talk about this also again as we go along, but a lot of these animals look the same because it turns out if you want to be a glider, well, having these big puffy like wings is something that helps you glide. So of course, over time, they end up kind of looking the same way, right? And so again, the idea here is that not only did the Darwin's finches, did they spread out from one island to another, but when they were on the islands themselves, they start to divide up the island according to niches. And then you get even more variations of the different birds because they have all these different beak types that are suited to just that particular spot, right? Like these ones must apparently only hang out on mangrove trees, right? Like they only hang out, they only evolve for that spot. And they look a little bit different than the ones that are woodpeckers or whatever it is like that, right? Now, one example that you heard about was these lizards, anole lizards from Puerto Rico and down in the Gulf of Mexico area, right? In this particular slide, which is called resource partitioning, you don't need to know the name of that, but the idea is that all these different lizards, some of them live on just the bottom trunks of the trees. Some of them only live on the leaves of the small bushes. Some of them only live way up high in the canopy, right? And they all had their adaptations to live in that particular place. But all of these lizards all had a common ancestor, right? And they kind of talked about this in the video that when after a hurricane, all the islands kind of get, some of the islands, especially the smaller ones, get kind of wiped clean of lizards because the hurricane just blows them all away. And so this gives the opportunity for other lizards to move in, right? And just like the Darwin's finches, they came across something that was very unique. They came across a situation where all of the niches were open, right? And so they then spread to every single niche, right? This is in a time of great environmental change. It allowed a very quick evolutionary response to that kind of change, right? And so there was great story of how they went and they actually put some of the lizards on these islands on purpose, and they measured how they were evolving, and even only a couple of generations they started to change. But then they started talking about something really interesting about how they stayed separate, right? Because it seems like there's these lizards that can kind of, they get washed around and blown around a lot. And so once one lizard got to a new island, what kept it from going back and just blending with the other group once they eventually found the other group again, right? And it had to do with these things called a dewlap, right? And it had to do with reproduction. The lizards that got moved to a new place, their dewlap, maybe they all started this way, but the ones that got blown to a different island or got moved by the scientists to a different island, their dewlap changes. And so then once these two groups get back together again, this one is looking for other lizards that have this color dewlap, whereas this guy over here is looking for lizards that have this color dewlap, or I guess it would be the female of these species, right? These are both males. But the point is that once this trait changes, then this leads to behavioral isolation. Maybe they could physically reproduce if they wanted to, but the ones from this group never choose the ones from that group because they look different, and vice versa, right? Now, here's another one of these kind of diagrams that shows the evolutionary tree. And the important thing that they're trying to show is that the original came and then split into all the 4 different islands. And then on the islands, you have your own adaptive radiations, that this island has its particular set of lizards that evolved for those particular microhabitats. Again, microhabitats meaning like the tree versus the on the trunk of the tree and things like that. But then this island has its own version of all the different lizards for the different microhabitats. And while they all look very, very similar, they're actually not that related. They're more related here to themselves than they are to the ones over here, even if they look the same. And that's because, again, they're all competing for the same basic kind of habitat, right? So adaptive radiation is something that's happened many, many times. But like I mentioned a minute ago, one of the things about it is that you don't come across this situation very much, right? How often is some animal going to show up in a new environment and just find it to be empty and open and ready for you to just go wherever you want to go and eat whatever you want to eat, right? Usually if you show up in a new place, there's already animals there. They are already eating the big seeds and the small seeds. So if you're trying to get in on their action, you're at a disadvantage because you're the newcomer and you haven't evolved for this place. So one time where adaptive radiation happens is during times of great upheaval, like say a mass extinction. Extinctions have played a very big role on the evolution of life on Earth. And while we'll get to talk more about it as we go along, the important thing here is that every time there's a mass extinction, there's a bunch of open niches that become available that were previously occupied, right? And so every time there's a lot of death, then there's a lot of evolution afterwards. In this graph, the width of the bar represents the number of families, a number of different types of species out there, right? So the thickness here compared to the thickness here, right? It got bigger, which means that there was more diversity and more species evolving. And then suddenly something happens right here and a lot of them die. So it gets skinny again. But as soon as that happens, then you go back out and they start to evolve and speciation happens and you get more and more species until the next mass extinction, right? And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mass extinctions that we know of, and we know of them because of the fossil record, which we'll talk about as we go along. Some people, many scientists actually, believe that we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. All of these extinctions were caused by environmental changes of some kind or another. The biggest one is this one right here, called the Great Dying. Tons and tons and tons of animals died there. We're not exactly sure. It's hard to tell exactly what's happening back 250 million years ago. But one of the things here is climate change, that because of the continents were moving around, maybe you remember learning about Pangea, that when they started to move around, it shifted the ocean currents, and that led to massive environmental change. But one of the important things here is that while this is the skinniest it gets, right? Like this is the biggest mass extinction. So many species went extinct. But this is also where the rebound is the steepest, right? It goes way down, but then immediately bounces back out, right? Much more steep line there, showing that it happened faster, right? And so the more open niches you make, just the more evolution you're going to have once the recovery starts. Now, the most famous in mass extinction, of course, is this one at 65 million years ago, because this is when the dinosaurs went extinct. And this opened the door for the adaptive radiation of mammals, right? And so in this graph again, the width of the lines show how many different species there are. So way back at the beginning of the Jurassic, there's a few mammals, right? Mammals did live at the same time as dinosaurs, but they were tiny little like rat-looking things that were just barely getting by, right? Like they were scavengers. They're having a hard time because all these dinosaurs over here, and especially during this period where there's even tons and tons of dinosaurs, those dinosaurs occupied most of the niches, right? If you were a little rodent-like mammal and you stick your head out of your little hole and you see some seeds over there and you say, oh, I want to go eat those seeds. Well, on your way there, you're going to find a dinosaur that also eats those seeds. Right? So then you're like, oh, maybe I won't go to the seeds. Maybe I can go eat some of those leaves over there. But there's another dinosaur already eating those leaves, right? So the mammals at the time have a very rough time of surviving. But then right here, the amount of dinosaurs just goes away, right? Either from an asteroid or maybe some volcanic activity or maybe a combination of things. Dinosaurs just go extinct. And as soon as that happens, suddenly the mammal group explodes, right? Because all of those niches that used to be taken over, now they're open. And when you poke your head out of your little hole and you see some seeds over there, you can go eat them because there's nobody else to eat them. They're all dead. But also, then your buddies, they want some food and they saw that you went over here to get the seeds. And so they're going to go over to those leaves. And then that's the adaptive radiation part. Now the animals are free to go and explore all the niches. They're not very good at most of the niches. Just like the Darwin's finches probably weren't the greatest at eating the big seeds or the small seeds at first. But because there's no other competition really other than themselves, there's no predators, there's no pressure, then they have the kind of the luxury of slowly adapting to their individual environments. And so you get all these different mammals that exist today. Now, before I go and talk about some mammals real quick, I want to point out again the crocodiles, right? Crocodiles are not technically dinosaurs. Notice their line doesn't connect with the dinosaurs, but they're related, right? Their ancestors have something to do with dinosaurs. But the reason I bring up the crocodiles is because of the fact that people, we call crocodiles living fossils, right? They're almost famous for being so unchanging that they've been the same this whole time for millions and millions and millions of years. They lived through the dinosaur extinction, right? They've been here at basically the same for all this time. And that has to do with the fact that their niche is very stable. While the rest of the world is going crazy at times, killing dinosaurs, mass extinctions, swamps, the places where crocodiles live the most, the swampy kind of areas or like big rivers like the Nile, those places didn't go away. So their habitat didn't really go away. And their way of life, their niche, is a very stable one. It turns out that the strategy of being really similar color to the water that you were in and being just under the surface and waiting for something to come right next to you and they can't see you and you just jump out of the water and attack it, that's a pretty good strategy. And they have all the traits, the crocodiles have all the traits that they need to accomplish that strategy. And so because their way of life hasn't changed, they haven't needed to evolve at all because they've just been doing their thing. But I do want to point out, and it's important to understand, that natural selection didn't stop. That baby crocodiles with bad mutations, they get eaten first. And crocodiles lay more eggs than will possibly make it to adults because some of them are going to get eaten, right? And so it's not that natural selection or evolution just stopped. It's just that they've reached a point where they haven't changed a lot, right? And so again, the amount of change depends on how many opportunities you might be having. And so let's take a look at this particular animal right here. You might have, I never saw one of these animals until I started looking into some of these things, right? This animal is called a civet. Yep, that's right, a civet. And they only live in Africa. And I brought it up because this is a weird looking animal. What other animals does this thing look like it might be related to? All right, well, again, I don't know exactly what you put there, but it looks like a lot of different things. It looks kind of like a raccoon. It kind of looks like a cat. It looks kind of like a hyena. It looks kind of like a dog. It looks like a lot of different things. And that's because this civet is the living relative of what was probably the earliest carnivorous mammal, which maybe looked like this. This is, of course, an artist's rendition. Like, we don't know exactly what they look like, but based on fossils and other information, they can try to piece it together, right? And so this guy right here is the original carnivore mammal, way down here, right? And so way back in the Paleocene probably, this guy lived. And then when the dinosaurs, right, they're gone. And so this guy, and he starts to spread across the area because wherever he goes, there aren't that many other mammals yet, right? And so there's then an adaptive radiation of just this one species into all the other species. They split into two basic groups, which could be, or three groups, but two main groups, which would basically be the cat group and the dog group, right? And over here on the cat group, you have the actual cat group. And then over that group must have split off, and then another split to make, these are the civets. And then here we have the hyenas. Hyenas are actually much more closely related to cats than they are to dogs. But they're actually even more closely related to civets than they are to cats. And again, hopefully that kind of makes sense when you look at the different traits that they have and realize that their traits had to have come from a common ancestor somewhere right here, and then the common ancestor with the cat, right? This group right here, these are weasels, and these are seals, right? And so one group kind of turned into the weasel / seal group. And then over here, like I said, the dog kind of group, you have your actual dogs, but you have your bears and raccoons and sea lions, right? These are the ones, these have ears basically, and these ones don't. There's other differences, but that's the easiest way to tell them from the outside, right? And so this is an adaptive radiation of just this one early species for all the carnivores, right? All the different carnivorous mammals on the earth can trace themselves back to this one ancestor. Now, this ancestor is just one part of an even bigger story, though, which would be the entire lineage of mammals. And like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff on this slide, right? But back here is the original ancestor, the closest thing that we have to those ancestors now, a platypus. These guys are interesting because they have a lot of mammal traits, like they have fur, they make milk, but they also have weird traits like they lay eggs still, like literally eggs, kind of like a reptile egg. But also their milk, they don't have any actually like teats. They don't have any where the milk comes from. So the milk kind of just comes out of their skin. Like they basically sweat milk, and then their babies just suck it off of their fur and stuff. It's very weird, right? But these are, they're very ancient. This group split into two groups, the marsupial group, which you only find in Australia now, except for a few things like possums that escaped. And then over here, you have the placentals, and this is us. This is all the regular mammals, right? And so you can see there's two splits where this split leads you towards elephants, but also towards anteaters. Is an elephant just like a really big mutant anteater? Maybe, kind of. They have a common ancestor back here from where their group split into the two groups. The other group leads to most of the other species. Over here, you have this branch leads to the carnivores, right? Here's the ones we were just talking about. So that's the part that we were just looking at. Down here, we have the rhinos and horses. That's right. Horses and rhinos go together. And then, surprisingly, bats, right? That's weird over there. This group are the kind of herbivore group. And then you have this group over here. That's kind of the weird group that I don't even remember what those ones are because of all these Latin names, right? I don't remember all of them exactly, but you can see the groups there, right? So you have this one group over here, which is basically the herbivores and the carnivores, or the big herbivores. Then over here, you have what I basically call the rodent group. Rodents, rabbits, right? And that's where rabbits kind of by themselves. A rabbit is a lot like a rodent, but also has other traits that aren't like a rodent. So they kind of have their own group. And then the rodent group also has a common ancestor with the primate group. Of course, that's where we are. And if you think about it, like a monkey is kind of like a squirrel with really long arms and legs and a longer tail, right? They're very closely related in what they do and their body shape. Now, this is what we think of as the original mammal, right? A little rat-looking thing that scurried around and just tried to compete with the dinosaurs as much as they could, right? So this is the mammal family tree, and there's a whole nother one of these things for reptiles and amphibians and birds and fish and all those ones, right? Because they have their own stories. And so in the end, you get this giant thing, right? This is the big tree of life that shows all of the different branchings or the major branchings, right? Like this doesn't show every single thing. It's way too complicated. So complicated that they had to like make it do this curving action, right? Where the mammals over here, they all have their common ancestor with actually reptiles. Dinosaurs and mammals have the same common ancestor. Maybe we'll get to that part. The birds definitely have their ancestors with the reptiles because they have a lot of reptilian traits, and they are what's living left from dinosaurs themselves. The amphibians, theirs goes back to where the fish are. The fish goes way back to where the first animals would have been found. These would have been the ancestors of like insects and lobsters and crabs and things like that. And then if you go back far enough, you get to the single-celled organisms, and then all the way back to the original life forms of bacteria, right? And so this big thing, this tree of life, is all just the big story of natural selection and speciation and adaptive radiation and mass extinctions, right? And then you can kind of look at any individual species and get the details, but that kind of tells the basic story of that. And so this is where we're going to go next. We're going to start talking about big evolution, the large view of evolution. Stop.